Hello again, cinema appreciation classes. Today I'm coming to you from one of my favorite places on the planet. Almost every summer I travel to the wonderful East African kind of savannah where I get to see some of the most amazing features, including such things as the great wildebeest migration, large panels of elephants and lions. One of my favorite songs because of this is, of course, the opening to The Lion King. I hope everything is going very well for you. While I'm over here in these more realistic settings that show up, today we're going to be talking about the difference between realism, specifically coming out of documentary film lines, and the idea of the French New Wave, which we will pick up with auteur theory next time. They are radically different approaches to filmmaking, and specifically to film editing. So if you remember and go back here, as we look at our lovely thing that we've looked at for editing all week, the idea of the editing styles of different films, we have realism, the idea of the documentary film very much more in the category over here in realism. The more you edit a film, the more you light a film, the more you change and reshoot things, the more you move towards classicism. And really, French New Wave is going to follow over with discontinuity editing all the way over here. French New Wave is very much what the auteur theory, where the author has a construction and image that they're trying to create. So it really is about halfway in between the idea over here, if I can find my cursor, of classicism versus formalism. So it would be right within here, about the same level as where expressionism is going to be. So we're going to look at two different extremes then of filmmaking that come out of Hollywood films today. Now, one of the things that shows up is that as we talk about the idea of realism, and it really does start with a French film critic who challenged Soviet formalist montage aesthetic and Hollywood cinema editing. This individual is André Bazin right here. You can see Cahiers de Cinema was a very famous magazine that came out actually about film theory starting in the 1940s, 1950s, 1960s. And so André Bazin didn't like the idea of Hollywood, right? He didn't like the idea of that modern aesthetic that showed up coming out of Birth of the Nation and later on Citizen Kane, because it wasn't about reality. Like, you could create images of reality, but most film was about narrative storytelling. It was largely about the entertainment industry. It was escapism from the idea of the dull or boring or harsh life that took place in America. And the Soviet formalist aesthetic with montage theory was so much based upon putting images to make you think about an image in the future rather than giving you an artistic vision. Bazin really likes a realistic film that gives you much more of a philosophical approach to the way the world really works. So he believes that, it's the second one up here, Bazin, believes that cinema should produce images of reality with a minimum of human interference, less editing, less lighting, right? The world as it unfolds before you, and basically cutting that story to continuity. So Bazin was not for absolute documentary realism, but rather the director should poeticize the commonplace. And so what he is going to celebrate more than anything else, he's going to lift up this new art movement that's called Italian Neorealism, that shows up at the very end of World War I and goes and brings us all the way through the interwar period to the end of World War II, and even after World War II. He likes the idea of directors who basically make themselves invisible because the action, the setting, the surrounding are so realistic that you get absorbed with everyday characters that happen to be in front of you. Ironically, the people that are going to follow him after his first generation in Cahiers de Cinema are very much going to believe in much more French New Wave, which is completely almost a complete rejection of everything we have here, and much more a move towards formalism. Not quite to formalism. Remember, halfway between classicism and formalism is the idea of auteur theory. These individuals are going to invent the idea of auteur theory that comes out of the ideas of Bazin, but they're specifically going to create, and they want to celebrate, rather than the negative aspect and the aftermath of the World War and how people were struggling, the new life that develops in the 1950s with new energy, new motion, new kind of morals and mores coming up from the French youth culture in particular, and then it spreads all throughout into London and Rome and the major centers around the world. Now, as we look at Italian neorealism features and the features that show up here, a couple things that are going to show up as we look through this. This is the period, as I said, between the interwar period between World War I and World War II, and the immediate aftermath of World War II. Italy, Germany, and even England had been devastated during this time period. And so their film have two options. They could go the American route and do American escapism, and we're going to do The Wizard of Oz and Gone with the Wind. We're going to have these wonderful escapist love fantasies so we don't have to live our everyday experience in front of us. Or alternatively, you can actually live the world in front of us through other characters who you absolutely emphasize with them because they can be your neighbors. They can be going through the same struggles that you're going to do. That's exactly what Italian neorealism is going to do. So it's a new democratic spirit. It's about ordinary people, such as laborers, that are struggling through life. So this is going to be much more of a philosophical bent. As it's philosophy and you get to need to know the characters, and many of them are not professional actors, it's going to take longer to develop. So we're going to have a lot less editing, a lot less lighting, a lot less of everything except the reality of the situation beforehand. We're going to make a very compassionate point of view with refusal to make moral judgments. And the Bicycle Thieves will actually iterate this more than anything else. Even at the end, we are not sure what the moral judgment is. Why? Because life is harsh, and if these are the choices that you have to make, what would you do? For example, if you were starving, would you be willing to steal bread for your family? I can tell you definitively that if I was in this boat, I absolutely would steal bread. I would have no problem with that at all. If I was absolutely starving and had no other way of making money. Now, what do we do if my child sees me stealing that piece of bread? Think, oh, Dad's moral and he's always telling us not to steal. What do I do? How do I explain that to my child who really doesn't understand the difference between gray, the gray area between black and white? Black don't steal, white be good all the time. And that gray area that, all right, sometimes it's okay to steal for this particular reason. They are going to, in these Italian neorealist films, they are, by all means, going to focus on Italy's fascist past and the aftermath of wartime life, which is horrific, right? All the factories are burnt up. There's no work. People are starving. There's no health care. They're selling anything they possibly can. And the emphasis is going to be on emotional reality. So when we look at Italian neorealism features, and note, an international movement, we've already looked at a few. We've seen German expressionism and the impact there. We've seen Soviet montage. So now we're going to look at Italian neorealism. The avoidance of plotted stories. It's basically what's the story of the struggle that the people that you're filming are in front of you. We're going to use actual locations. So if we pick an actor, we might actually use their house. We're going to use conversational speech, and we're not going to go back and edit it a lot. It's going to be a documentary visual style. We're often even going to use non-professional actors, and we're going to the idea of the avoidance of editing artifice. So the most famous individual and film from this time period is this, and this is absolutely in your top 100 list. It's called The Bicycle Thieves from 1948 by Vittorio De Sica. Now, if we think through the ramifications as we talk about this film and watch a little bit of it, nearly 25% of Italy was unemployed, and the lead actor was a factory worker. So we get to go into his factory. We get to go into his home. So the idea here is that it's the action taking place before us, and we're only going to edit for continuity to try to bring out the best story that happened while we're filming.
When La G di Bicicletta was distributed in America, it was given the title The Bicycle Thief, but its actual translation, Bicycle Thieves, was given to later releases of the film. Now this sounds like a minor detail, but it will become important later. Bicycle Thieves is the story of Antonio, a man in post-World War II Italy who receives a job offer. He needs a bicycle to perform it, and when he finally gets one, it's stolen, and Antonio
and he has to sell all of his sheets in order just to get that's the last thing he has to sell to get his bicycle out of hock.
Understanding neorealism requires historical context. Art movements sometimes spring up for reasons of influence from other art forms or masterpieces from sudden new prodigies in their fields, but art is also cultural and reflects attitudes of its time, recent history, and tragedy. Italy under Prime Minister Benito Mussolini actually forcibly colonized Ethiopia in a war that lasted between 1935 and 1936. Italy also played a role in supporting nationalists in the Spanish Civil War in 1936, in hopes of gaining favor with the victors and hopeful subservience. There's even more, but the long and short of it is that Italy was actively engaged in taking over parts of the Mediterranean even before what we would consider World War II. Italy waited until 1940 before declaring war on Great Britain and France. For the former, at least in Italy, we were given Neorealism, Italians wondered about their national identity and who they really were as a people. Because of these introspective attitudes, this film style flourished. So what is Italian neorealism? Well, first, it focuses on the poor, the working class who are trying to survive in post-war Italy, real hardships. It's generally filmed on location and not in sound stages, real cities. The style insists on non-professional actors, real people. In short, Italian neorealism is the attempt to set aside any self-glorification or decadence, and through both the narrative and the technique, create something real. Not a documentary, but a fictional narrative without falsehoods and storybook endings. A real window into the soul of Italy. Vittorio De Sica once said that neorealism isn't meant to be reality, but reality filtered through poetry. That may be the best definition. Realism sounds like it wouldn't have as much to say as something more expressive, but even a portrait can tell tales. This is American Gothic, a famous work by Grant Wood, painted realistically. But notice the commentary on labor. Look closely. The pitchfork scene here is replicated in the stitching on the man's clothes, and his jawline, and the window that draws the eye. Commentary made from realistic representation. And that brings us back to Bicycle Thieves. Everything in the film is shot to show the desperation of the workers and income inequality. Take, for example, this scene. Antonio's job involves pasting posters on walls. The one we see displayed most prominently is a poster of Rita Hayworth, a famous Hollywood movie star. Antonio, struggling for work, desperately trying to make ends meet, going to great lengths just to get a bicycle, has a job in which he hangs up posters of the rich and famous. The imagery here is striking, letting us know that the glitz and glamour of Hollywood in the 1940s is an illusion. But neorealism, what we're seeing here, is a closer representation of the real world.
As I said, Hollywood was about
Economic
escapism.
division is shown again in this scene, as Antonio and Bruno eat inexpensive food at a restaurant while a wealthier family sits at the next table. They are styled to be their opposites. The whole family is there. They can all afford to eat together in a big meal. The son has his hair curled and well managed, whereas Bruno's hair is tousled. The cinematography of Bicycle Thieves centers around long, static shots, like this one. The camera is less of a participant and more like a spy, watching the characters without judgment or romanticization. Shots in which other citizens of the city are walking by or driving feel less staged and more natural. Even this scene, in which Bruno is almost struck by traffic, is played off as just a minor occurrence, although that's probably because it was an accident. The young actor really was almost struck by passing cars. That's not to say that much of the film was improvised. Most of it was meticulously planned by De Sica. It looks natural. There are very few close-ups in the film. Usually we see the entirety of each character in the frame, or at least 2/3 of them in walking scenes. It gives us this sense that they're real people with real problems and not just props moving around set pieces. The film primarily used non-professional actors and first-time actors. I say first time because Lamberto Maggiorani, the actor who played Antonio, actually started acting professionally after shooting this film. This had less to do with a sudden love of acting and more because, in a frightening display of life imitating art, he found himself unemployed. Director Vittorio De Sica once said of non-professional actors, "The man in the street, particularly if he is directed by someone who is himself an actor, is raw material that can be molded at will. It is sufficient to explain to him those few tricks of the trade which may be useful to him from time to time, to show him the technical and, in the best sense of the term, of course, the histrionic means of expression at his disposal. It is difficult, perhaps impossible, for a fully trained actor to forget his profession. It is far easier to teach it, to hand on just the little that is needed, just what will suffice for the purpose at hand." In addition to Bicycle Thieves helping to revolutionize film in its era and usher in a new style, it also employs tried and true narrative devices to capture the audience in the story, namely foreshadowing. Early in the film, Maria hands Antonio his cap that he needs for work. She jokes that he looks kind of like a police officer. Later in the film, after his bicycle is stolen, he informs the police what happened. But they tell him they are powerless to do anything. Antonio is upset, asking if he must now solve his own crime. The police do nothing. And so Antonio has made himself as a sort of police officer, because the actual police don't see it as a major crime. The police appear again and again in the film, never willing to do anything. Bicycle Thieves conveys a mistrust of police. Bear in mind, Italy was only recently under the thumb of Mussolini and in Axis power. There is bound to be some mistrust of government in an Italian neorealist film. Another example of foreshadowing is the title itself. Remember, when Americans first saw the film, they thought it should be called The Bicycle Thief. But the real translated title is Bicycle Thieves, plural. Antonio, frustrated that he can't find his bicycle, steals another one. The title is foreshadowing. There are two. Only when Antonio steals the bike does the title begin to make sense. The build-up to Antonio stealing the bike is incredible. After trying everything else, he sits down with his son, looking defeated, and then sees bicycles everywhere, riding by, carried by people everywhere. If only he could have one. This goes on for a couple minutes, and the suspense is both thrilling and uncomfortable. We spent the last hour and a half sympathizing with this man who wants nothing more than to take care of his family. Then a wide-angle shot of Antonio near the bicycle, still debating it in his mind, looking around, creeping closer and closer, until finally making his decision, all the while not knowing his son is nearby, about to discover what his father has become. Then he's caught. Watch this scene.
Dove portavo? Al Flaminio ai Parioli. Al Flaminio? Al Flaminio dove portavo? Ci andiamo tanti adesso, se io sapevo dal commissariato. Ci andiamo io e Pasquale e basta. Lascia stare, lascio vedere. E mo me la lascio qui. Non voglio bici, lascio stare. Buongiorno a tutti e grazie. Bella roba che insegna a tuo figlio. Manca la vergogna. Sei fortunato che hai trovato quello lì. Ma se era per me ci portavo dentro. Vattene a casa che ti ha detto bene. Ma va, fila, fila. È meglio che te ne vai, va.
The owner doesn't press charges. Why not? We'll come back to that in a minute. The causes of crime are complex and specific to individual acts. There are crimes of passion, hate, but what people sometimes don't want to face is that crime is often an act of desperation, of poverty. Antonio didn't ask for Italy to go to war and create this mess for his country, but he must face the consequences of more powerful men. It's easy to say, well, he shouldn't have stolen the bicycle, but this is a man faced with extreme poverty and the responsibility of taking care of his family. Should his child starve because of the finer points of morality? It's an impossible situation. What is his greater responsibility? To the law or to his family? That doesn't excuse his actions, but it should explain them.
And that's one of the things that shows up with a lot of international films. International films are generally shot at a much slower pacing, so you actually literally can think about the philosophical elements. And so, you know, sometimes an international film, as I mentioned before in the editing, might only last 1,000 shots in a 2-hour, 2.5-hour films, whereas a Hollywood and Avengers movie might have 2,000 or 2,500. So it's constant action and movement and everything else. Here, this is meant to make us think. In many cases, maybe make us cry within the aspect, sympathize with someone who is struggling with the process. So in a lot of European and international films, you're meant to actually go out to a bar or a cafe with friends afterward and talk about the film. We generally don't do that. Once Avengers is over, we say, oh, that's cool, it's awesome. We can talk about it, but we have very superficial conversations. How many of us actually ever had the conversation on whether Thanos snapping his fingers at the end of the Avengers Infinity War was a good thing because it saved 50% of the world's population from suffering, even though 50% of the world's population had disappeared? That's a real philosophical conversation. And if that was done by a European director, it probably would have focused much more along those levels. So that's something that we have to see as a difference between Hollywood entertainment versus the idea of deep philosophical roots, which is what film began with.
Because that means that we as a society have failed, and that we bear some responsibility for the ills of our culture. So why did the owner let him go? Because he recognized why Antonio did it. For his son. He's not a malevolent person. He's just desperate. The world can be harsh and cruel. This scene isn't just about forgiveness. It's also about understanding. In a sense,
and he still has to deal with the idea of what his son now thinks about him. That's the heartbreaking and wrenching at the end of this movie.
It's explainable and shouldn't be dismissed as just a vile, malicious act. Even in the beginning of the film, when Antonio gets a job, we find that people have been categorized into occupations, pigeonholed into their professions, creating a sense that their lives are predetermined, faded into a kind of caste system. There's a line from the film that I rather like. Antonio says to Bruno, "There's a cure for everything but death." He says it cheerfully, but to me, the line always feels like it means, we have to survive. To quote words far wiser than my own, it's easy to be a saint.
Look at that sad ending as you walk off and have to understand how a father is going to explain what happens to his son within the aspect. And that's what Italian neorealism is. It's very dark, it's very kind of foreboding, but it deals with philosophical images that show up with poverty, with individuals that are struggling. Later on, we're going to see this in what we call third world cinema, or developing cinema of kind of revolutionaries who are having the same issues in absolute poverty as one of our film styles. And that will be another international style. Films coming out of Cuba, Brazil, Venezuela, that are kind of the underground, that's almost impossible to be shown. So they're shown on makeshift theaters. And so we call that the theater of the third world theater, or the idea theater of the repressed. So we're going to see those aspects that come up as well. Now, out of this, the new filmmakers in the aftermath, and as we start to redevelop society, particularly in France, the idea of the French New Wave, or the Nouveau Vague, that show up, and later on Quentin Tarantino is going to borrow on this, really like what the neoclassics or what the neorealists have done, but they want something about our modern day lifestyle. The new hip capitalist culture that's starting to take off in the 1950s, 10 years after the war. And so his Bazan's youngest proteges created a more flamboyant film style, like Godard and Truffaut. So images like Breathless, which we saw earlier for discontinuity ending. And I believe that what a movie says is bound up in how it is said. So it should not just be about what it says, but how it is said. Editing styles then should be determined by the subject matter itself. So if we want to create something new, we've got to break some of the rules that Hollywood editing or montage theory editing has set up, which you even see within the Italian neorealist. That's a Hollywood editing style, just very slow paced. Their features are going to include long tracking shots, youthful spirit, current social issues on location, the intention of experimenting with wild full form, portable equipment. We had just invented the movable camera, or the handheld camera, existential themes such as stressing the individual and the acceptance of the absurdity of human existence, particularly in the aftermath of World War II. Remember, these are nihilist existentialists. You have Nietzsche and other philosophers that really are speaking this generation. They're going to have improvised dialogue. So they're going to take about half comes out of Italian neorealism, but they're going to use the editing and all the tricks of the trade, and they're going to start experimenting with new forms to show a new youthful vigor. And that's what we see in the French New Wave, arguably one of the most important film movements in all history, so much so that the French New Wave later on is going to be English New Wave, Taiwan New Wave, American New Wave. We're going to see it, but French New Wave is really where it all begins here, out of Cahiers de Cinema and the aftermath, the people that are following Bazin. So while Bazin supports this Italian neorealist, his proteges radically disagree.
Live.
So look how different this is than anything we've seen before.
So far on this channel, we've looked at specific films and specific genres for analysis. We haven't really ventured into the history of cinema. So what better place to start than arguably the most important few years in film culture? If you haven't guessed what I'm talking about the era of the French New Wave. Now, odds are, if you study movies or have a keen interest in the medium, then you more than likely have at least heard of this term before, but may not actually know what's so influential about it. I'd encourage everyone by the end of this video to look further into the history of the New Wave, and definitely watch the films associated with it.
Particularly if you're a fan of Quentin Tarantino and new cinema.
It shows that you don't need to.
He is very much inspired by this movement. His new youthful icon.
For the sake of brevity, here's the story of the French New Wave's genesis in a nutshell. It's Paris in the late 50s, and four French film enthusiasts write and discuss about cinema as they don't have the money to make their own films. Jean-Luc Godard, Francois Truffaut, Claude Chabrol, and Jacques Rivette become known as the Young Turks. They talk about how movies feel stale due to a lack of innovation in the industry. For that reason, they decide to
remember, because we had the Hollywood style and montage theory, and no one had started to put them together yet.
A large aspect of the New Wave, which also goes by the name La Nouvelle Vague, was to create a personal kind of cinema, one in which the film professed the director's life experiences and philosophies. The clip you're about to see is from Jean-Luc Godard's short film, The Small Soldier.
I know that idea about showing the the idea of the author gives you the idea that the film is auteur, or made by an author. So this is going to be the birth of auteur theory, coming out of Bazin's protégés.
Captured French life during the 50s and 60s, and they felt that the best way to present that to the world was through cinema.
Que le cinéma était très bien, simplement que ça manquait de sincérité et qu'il fallait faire la même chose en mieux.
However, they couldn't use the already established film techniques of their predecessors because that wasn't reflective of their life. It resembled an era of movies that they thought were outdated. In order to create a true representation of their lives, their films needed to differentiate themselves from their older counterparts, so they ventured into developing a new style of filmmaking. The result was, whatever films had been doing up to that point to tell their stories, they needed to create an alternative. But this wasn't just a case of being different for the sake of it, but to develop original techniques that could substitute the already existing methods. They wanted to show that things could be done differently, and do that by slapping the face of conventional cinema.
Au cinéma, c'est comme ça et pas autrement.
The French New Wave didn't destroy the pre-established rules films had used for years. They simply added to them, and you can see that the medium is a better place for it. So let's see why we should be so thankful.
These are some
for
what
this
we want artists to do.
What they
Learn the rules and then break them,
was
or
a
change
breaking
them.
of the rules. Whatever books that said this is how it had to be done, they burned them.
The first thing you're likely to notice about a French New Wave film is its editing.
No, not cutting the continuity. That's really a variation of discontinuity.
Well, first off, let's enhance on some of the components of editing, specifically cuts. What's the meaning behind a jump cut? Well, a jump cut is both spatial and temporal. Let me make that easier. A jump cut is used to show the difference in both the space and time between two shots. And we can separate jump cuts into two distinct functionalities. To match two shots,
Drive, turn, and
Right, cutting on action.
or to mismatch two shots.
Discontinuity editing.
The latter being the reason as to why jump cuts were mainly avoided prior to the New Wave.
It makes you
Editing's
conscious
purpose
you're watching
back
a
then was to
film,
maintain continuity in scenes
rather than just
and
watching a
keeping
story
flowing at a
happening
very
before you.
specific pace.
If we were to think about the films that were being made, there was a certain film language that was very, very distinct, certain kinds of coverage.
This is the Hollywood
long
style or
shots,
invisible cutting.
two shots, single. There was almost a formulaic way of presenting films. This film language was very strict. And in
So much so that we don't even notice
there
it
were
today.
rules
It's
that
called invisible
one
cutting.
felt could not be broken.
These rules were a way of keeping editing invisible, but there's nothing intrusive about it, so the audience doesn't notice it. This is fine depending on the type of movie you're creating, but if there's one thing about the Young Turks, it's that they wanted to be noticed. Seeing how conversations were edited in other pictures at the time, let's take a look at how a conversation was edited in Godard's
This
Breathless.
is what we saw discontinuity editing. And again, one of the 100 most important films because of the discontinuity editing.
Très joli poignet, un très joli front, de très jolis genoux.
No master shot, no reaction shot, no over the shoulder, and flooded with discontinuous editing. When you edit a conversation scene with jump cuts, what you do is contrast two pieces of footage instead of complement. The result? The audience becomes more conscious that they're watching a movie.
Je lui donne rendez-vous, on déjeune ensemble, vous voulez lui dire, voilà, on est bons amis, je trouve qu'on devrait coucher ensemble. Pourquoi? Et je ne sais pas.
As we established, the New Wave was about representing the spirit of their era by using new techniques to create a new style of filmmaking. That style was to make the audience aware that they were watching a film. It demystified audiences at the time as it didn't follow Hollywood's editing etiquette.
Tu vas maintenant?
New York Herald.
Tournez pas la tête, regardez devant vous. Quoi ça sert d'y faire des articles?
But by doing so, they were able to reduce restrictions on the assembly of their movies. They made filmmaking look easy. The term montage is the French term for assembly when editing. And if it wasn't for this style of editing, the modern day montage may not have existed.
So they are going to take the Soviet model of montage and move it into a new way of looking at it. And that's how we got montage.
And the overall creative force behind the picture. During the New Wave, another theory was created, known as la camera stylo, which literally means that a director should use their camera the same way a writer would use their pen. This simple concept has changed filmmaking. The idea that a director could have his or her own visual trademarks and stylings that would personalize their films has enhanced creativity in this medium.
That's what basically become auteur theory.
Why we have auteurs today. Movies became less dictated by the big studios, and the directors of the French New Wave, through their own innovation, became auteurs themselves. The editing stylization of the New Wave was too an influence in itself. By cutting out moments that the filmmakers felt weren't important to the scene, it sped up the film. Ever since then, movies' paces have increased significantly. These filmmakers understood the grammar of film so well that they realized that the audience doesn't have to be shown everything. An example of this
we're going to go from 800 scenes in a movie to almost 2,000 today.
You would move from one location to another through a dissolve, and then you'd have to watch your character walk to wherever it is they were going. This isn't necessary. So what was the New Wave's alternative? Just cut to it. This comprehension of film language contributed to the golden rule of show, don't tell. Because they realized that not only do you not need to tell, but sometimes you don't even need to show. But if you do need to introduce a setting, you don't need to spend an entire scene showing off the surroundings. Francois Truffaut would simply pan towards a setting if it was in the same area. That way you have the transition and establishing shot all in one take. Which brings us to the second most noticeable aspect of the New Wave, camera movement. Now, handheld cameras weren't used exclusively by the directors of the Nouvelle Vague, but the concept of an unencumbered camera was still in its infancy. So in order to differentiate themselves from what they deemed archaic cinema once more, they experimented with moving the camera as opposed to leaving it static. Truffaut liked to pan and move quickly during a scene. Godard typically tracked from a low angle in front of his characters. Agnes Varda tracks slowly through her settings, almost like a POV shot. These are just a few instances I've chosen because there's no definitive definition for what a moving camera means in a film. But we can look at the difference between the movements of the New Wave compared to the stasis of older flicks. For one, camera movement can make a closed frame scene become an open frame
The
scene.
closed frame.
This changes your movie's tone.
Watch this beautiful
the
shot here.
environment feels less encapsulated to what's just in the frame. It's like when we see an actor look or interact with the subject on screen, we subconsciously assume that there is a world outside of what we see. But I'm sure I've spoken about this technique before. Pick any scene in any New Wave film, and you're more than likely to see the camera do something unconventional. Two people talking, camera moves. Someone entering a scene, camera moves. You could argue that this was art through adversity, as they couldn't afford the best technology at the time, but regardless, this technique became a staple of the New Wave. The directors took influence from documentaries at the time to capture a fly-on-the-wall feel. The movements of the camera were blurring the lines between art and reality. But the thing that I find most interesting about this is that because the directors of the New Wave wanted to be different from what they called cinema du papa, whenever camera movement was typically used for a scene, they would use editing. And whenever editing was typically used, they used camera movement. Here's a clip from Double Indemnity. A woman is hiding from a man, and the tension is displayed through editing.
And brother, the things they would squeeze are. We haven't got a single thing to go on, Keith. Oh, not too much. Just 26 years experience, all the percentage there is, and this hunk of concrete in my stomach.
But now here's another scene from Breathless. A woman is hiding from a man, but this time the tension is displayed through the movement of the camera. An alternative. They didn't want to be different for the sake of it. They wanted to find new methods that worked in the same way the older techniques did. And if the editing and movement of the camera wasn't enough to change the style of films forever, the other thing the New Wave was famous for was its unorthodox, in-your-face approach. But once more, all they were really doing were finding new ways to convey the same message. For example, you need to show something important to the audience. So what's the best way to do that? Most people would probably say a close-up. And yeah, that's fine. But remember, that's not the style of the Nouvelle Vague. They didn't want to immerse you in a realistic sense. Their techniques were very playful. So instead of a close-up, how about altering the frame itself? This still gives us the same function as a close-up, as the camera is
works
drawing
out of
our
the Birth of a
attention
Nation, the Irish shot that was invented.
Playing with the frame and developing alternate techniques has been essential in newer auteurs enhancing their own styles. By using this technique, you can go from a close-up to a wider angle without cutting or even moving the camera, all while maintaining the essence of that self-aware style. They even broke their own newly established rules of editing. Instead of using montages, which their films used extensively, show multiple shots of the same scene at once in the frame. Another famous technique to show emphasis was to use freeze frames. Again, this could have been done with a close-up or perhaps a slow zoom to enhance the subject to the scene, but instead they took a snapshot of the moment. I find this technique more dramatic because it's almost as though it immortalizes a moment in time. If cinema is truth 24 times a second, it makes you wonder what was so spectacular about that one truth. With all these techniques, you're still conveying various pieces of information to the viewer, but doing so by altering the perceptions of what you're allowed to do with cinema. These directors were still breaking the fourth wall, which, by the way, was another technique that they enjoyed using. If you're still skeptical as to whether the Nouvelle Vague intentionally toyed with the audience's expectations, just look at how many times their movies directly acknowledge them. The Nouvelle Vague wanted to have the audience tested as to what could be a movie and how they could push the boundaries of storytelling, not just with their techniques, but with their content too. Many of the films would often feature non-sequiturs because they could. It added to the free-spirited nature they aimed for.
For 30 to 40 years, cinema had been dominated by rules of continuity and rules of matching and establishing shots, which had produced completely seamless cinema. People broke those rules.
So what can we learn from the directors and the films of the French New Wave? Well, the best way to see their influence is to just watch the films. They're so ahead of their time, it's not difficult to see. You don't think the editing is that spectacular? Tell that to Scorsese.
It's from Taxi Driver.
The idea of the director as an author and the film as their novel wasn't a unique perspective. Tell that to Tarantino. And camera movement was just a basic technique. Tell that to Emmanuel Lubezki. The thing that the filmmakers of La Nouvelle Vague did was utilize one of the most important thought processes I think there is for an artist. Look at what works in your medium and think, how can it be done differently? Because if you don't have anything new to say, what's the point of saying anything? So try it. Whatever your next creative endeavor might be, look at what everyone else is doing and think of a new way it can be done. And you might see that sometimes by breaking the rules, you can make new ones of your own.
La photographie, c'est la vérité. Et le cinéma, c'est 24 fois la vérité par seconde.
And so the idea that actually shows up here then is that we are breaking all of the rules. We're forming kind of auteur theory, which we'll actually cover the next time that we get together. And this is going to lead us also into the idea of realism versus this more different aspect of realism, as weird as that sounds. So we have two early documentary theories that are going to develop. We're going to have an American versus a Soviet, no surprise. We're going to have Grierson versus Vertov. And Grierson is an American, says that a documentary film form should be a creative treatment of actuality. And it doesn't have to be actual, but it's a creative treatment to get a story across on a particularly important time. Whereas Vertov, Ziga Vertov, absolutely disagrees with that. It says, life is as it is. It should be cinematic truth, whether you're editing it or not, should still be the truth of the situations, not a reenactment, not a showcase that shows up. And so we come up with the idea of what are documentary film ethics. What does it mean to make an ethical documentary film? For example, March of the Penguins, about 15 years ago. It was supposed to be about the penguins actually in their walk across Antarctica for mating season. Well, what do you do if there's a baby penguin that falls that you could save as a documentary film, or you sit there and film it and watch it die? Which is the film ethics? Because your job, remember, is a documentary filmmaker. Every time you change and manipulate, you've changed the population. Even if it's only by one, you've changed the population of what's taking before you. If you're in Nazi Germany and you see a Nazi killing a Jewish individual that's unarmed for no reason, do you have an ethical responsibility to report that? Or if you're trying to show the positive aspects of Nazi Germany, to eliminate that out? What's the way that we should use documentary film ethics? It becomes a very challenging issue. And so the first documentary films we can really look at is really our first film. Going all the way back to the pre-1900, again, this is The Arrival of a Train by the Lumiere brothers. We could actually consider this our first documentary film. In 1920s, we're going to romanticize this. And so this becomes one of the challenges, is that one of our first early great documentary films is Robert Flaherty. He basically wants to create the primitive past rather than the present. So even though this was filmed in the 1920s, Robert Flaherty specifically asked his individuals, and his star that's going to go on a world tour is one of the native individuals, the Eskimo, now called the Inuit, who's actually Nanook, going to go on a world tour throughout Paris and London with him, basically showing the way of life. But rather than showing how these natives lived in the 1920s, he wants them to really think about how they lived in the early 1850s or 1860s. So even though they could use guns and certain weapons and certain tools that they've actually acquired through trade, he asked them not to, so he could actually create a world that was really a world that had no longer existed, rather than the world that had been impacted by more colonial mindsets. The question then, is this really a documentary film? And they didn't have an answer back then. We still don't have an answer. So here's the filmmaking. It's pretty amazing. So here's the film scene where you see him making an igloo, but not in the 1920s model like they would do, rather in the way that his grandfather probably would have done, or maybe even his father. I know living in Miami, you just get cold watching this. And you can see it's just blocks of snow. So we usually think we dig out, put snow together in a pile and mash it all and dig it. It actually is blocks of snows that are just hardened. The snow itself forms the insulation. Playing down a hill on the ice. So that means they're going to pack it with ice. Sometimes even run a little heat like their hand over it, so it unfreezes and then refreezes. Note the baby inside of the coat, so they're protecting each other with the body heat. Now, as we get closer and closer to the end, I want to show you. No, he's going to measure out in the ice this perfect block and then chisel it out. An ice could be a foot thick. Now watch, takes the ice out. He's got a giant ice cube now he can use. And the first time I thought this was pretty amazing. See how it's clear and see-through? He's cutting the igloo to have a window in it. So light can come in, so you can actually follow the motion of the sun and moon and see what's happening out in terms of light condition. And note the highly polished that shows up. All just using natural material there. He has the same thing that he wants to do in terms of romanticism of showing this fishing scene. So what do we do with a scene like this as a fishing? This is one of my favorite scenes in the entire film. So again, he's romanticizing. This is not how people fished in the 1920s. And yet in the 1800s, when Grandpa used to fish, or great-grandpa, this is exactly the fishing techniques they would have had from Nanook of the North. And note to set the classical music, the whimsical classic music kind of makes the scene amazing. So here's an individual that's going to go fishing. This is actually on the ice that's melted over on the North Arctic Sea. So he's just going to drill a small little hole and then kind of wait, try to catch a fish. Here's the blowhole. So you can barely see where the fish is. He was waiting for a fish to come through and try to get it. Watch the fish. He's going to try this. Now, normally they would have a gun for this, so it wouldn't be an issue, at least in the 1920s. In the 1800s, you're only spearfishing. So he clearly has a fairly big fish he's got to get out. He's got to pull it out to that hole. Of course, Americans in this time period have never seen fishing like this ever before. Right? This is a completely unique phenomenon. There is no National Geographic. There is no, History Channel. There's not even TV. So you barely see it in films. This is one of those early films, Nanook on the Door, from the 1920s. Kind of that's established the tradition of what documentary film can do and make people from around the world stars. This is Nanook himself. Note how big that fish must be. As we go through, you'll realize there's a lot more fighting. And then note, all of a sudden, people see that he's around, still fighting with that fish. His friends are going to come help him. So they don't lose the fish. Look at all those people now pulling on that fish. Look what he just caught with that blowhole. He caught a seal. In that little hole floating above the ocean, this individual used 1800 technology along with his friends, and they just basically caught enough food for the entire family to eat for weeks. Look how large these animals actually are. And they're going to use the coat of the seal, of course, for boots and for water-absorbent materials. But look how enormous it is. That's probably 600 pounds that you just caught from a tiny little blowhole. So the question is that really a documentary film? Or because it's a recreation, a historic recreation of something from the past, even though it's his own ancestors, should that count truly as a documentary film? We generally do consider it as a documentary film because we don't have clear parameters. We have other ones, Walter Ruttman's, for example, Berlin, Symphony of a Great City, also challenging the notion of documentary films from 1927. And the film here is shot and edited kind of like a visual poem with not much narration. And so basically, he would go to different cities, and he would photograph what individuals were doing in different cities at different times of day or in different working conditions. And so he put all of his work stuff together, or alternatively, all the stuff that was happening between 12 and 1 around lunchtime together. So you get an overall, almost a visual tone poem of what's happening in the city at any given hour of the day. And he did this all over the world. So it would be New York, Symphony of a Great City. Berlin was his first great Symphony of a Great City. You know, the story then is about the city, not about any individual. The question is, does documentary film early on have to be only about people, which most documentaries earlier on was? This is literally about the city life itself and showing you how Berlin is different than New York. Or similar to New York, it doesn't matter, they just speak a different language. So here you can see the busy rush hour. We scan through. He's just filming people on the city street from a time period. So a visual tone poem of what's going on at any given time. One of the most famous documentary films of all time is this one by Leni Riefenstahl. And this is a challenging documentary film. And the question is it really documentary film if it's accurate, but if you take off all the bad stuff and you only put the positive and make it about propaganda? So this is a film from Triumph of the Will, by Triumph of the Will, that celebrates Hitler as a great leader, as a great individual. So it was done by his official propaganda board. But note, everything that takes place is actually accurate. It is the only live footage that we have of Hitler during our own time period. So if you've seen any other films that deal with Hitler, whether it's Indiana Jones or going all the way to an image that shows up in Citizen Kane, they're playing off of this documentary footage that was released by the Nazi Empire. And so here you see Leni Riefenstahl, one of the great female directors of all time. But of course, because she was making art to celebrate and promote Hitler, she really had difficulty finding any other work afterwards. So those are actually Hitler's real voice, real look from the time period. And the question is, if propaganda is accurate, which it is, and you just hide facts, does that still make it a documentary film? Again, another challenge to documentary film, which we still haven't fully addressed today. In the 1950s, we're going to come up with cinema verite.
American family, take one.
The idea that you have a moving camera that you can actually follow around individuals.
West Coast Kennedy. We got a family to be proud of.
And so you can literally make real films about real people in real time, which was really difficult to do beforehand.
Conservative American family, the ideal family, wherever the family goes. We go. The house, the school, the supermarket.
What about the bathroom?
Gentlemen, meet the Louds. The handsome, hard-working dad. Roll again. There you go. The smart, sultry mom.
I like sultry.
Wait till you see the firstborn. Solid gold.
You do realize that we're being followed by a camera crew, Lance?
Yes.
So the basis later on is the Truman Show. And so on some level, they're wondering, with following the cinema verite idea, is that cinema verite tell you truth, or again, are you acting for the camera in everything that you do? Which makes it an interesting feature as well. Again, challenging what a documentary film is. What do we do with documentaries without words that are just about images? Talk about a documentary being a visual tone poem. This was presented by Francis Ford Coppola, the same individual who actually directs the Godfather trilogy. And so this is called Koyaanasqatsi, as you'll see here, which is a Native American word. But like Berlin, Symphony of a City, or Symphony of a Great City, that we saw by Rautman, here we have an individual that actually takes this on and combines the natural world, religious rituals, and what's going on in the modern world in 2.5 hours, in very slow moving, almost Buddhist elements that's going to lead to modern day music. The music here, if you don't know, is done by Philip Glass, who won an Academy Award for the music because it was so evocative, because people weren't sure what they were actually watching. as they were trying to put the film in some kind of meaningful context. Again, this is not necessarily telling a story, or is it telling the story of mankind? And that's something for you to determine. So is it classical style, or is this more realist style that's technology? Then the technology of those rock drawings early on, we were trying to figure out what humanity meant. So those little pieces are actually ice shards that are falling off. There's also a modern variation on this one today. This was actually a trilogy eventually. There's a modern one today about 10 years old that's called Baraka, which goes through the religious life around the planet and how different religions have changed over time. Just to show you where we go, I'm going to fast forward a little bit through. So you can see this is all in the rocket ship. Now we're going to look at the aerial view of the rocket ship above the world. Right, so we went from the drawings on the rocks, the red color of the fire, which bled into modern technology, and now the view that we have of the world with modern technology over those rocks we were marked. And this is just the first section then, where we're looking over beautiful settings, Southwest United States, and Monument Valley, where basically all of our cowboy movies were made. The next stage then goes into the city. And so we look at all over the world. And the question, is that really a documentary film? Because what are you documenting and how are you trying to document? Clearly, it's highly edited and manipulated, but in very long takes, which is one of the features of realism. The most challenging one becomes this one. Again, all the facts in Bowling for Columbine, all the facts are accurate. There's nothing here that's inaccurate. They just handpicked which facts to show to make fun of the United States of America and our gun laws. So the question is that really a documentary film or a piece of a documentary film? We run into the same problem on how do we define a documentary film if it can contain all these other elements, and some are propaganda films that are accurate, some are animations, some are recreations, some are historical reenactment. We don't really have a great handle on that as we value and develop kind of what is the idea of realism and reality that shows up, because we have so many different features of reality, so many different features in a realistic kind of documentary style film, from not being heavily edited, which the last one was, it's animation. It's absolutely a distortion of movement that shows up. But is that worse than actually showing a real event and skipping over things that might be negative when we look at the Nazi propaganda film of Triumph of the Will? Or only showing one side of a story in a documentary film rather than showing both sides and letting the audience make up? We don't really have an explanation for that. And so that becomes a real challenge. So the last one I'll leave you here with is the entire idea for you. It's basically how our films even get rated. It's a film documentary that's called This Film Is Not Yet Rated. I highly recommend come looking at it, because basically, if you don't know, your films are rated R, X, PG, PG-13 by people that A, you never meet, that basically there's not a review board that shows up, and by individuals that are pretty conservative in the way that they think, feel about the world around. And this is a pretty good paying job that you basically can be on here for life. It pays more than $100,000 a year. But we don't know who the people are, so it's really hard to make a film that caters to them, and that becomes one of the challenges that we have. So thank you very much and have a wonderful day. Bye.